Our theme for today is recycled stories in the Bible. And we're going to use the flood story as an example. And so, let me start by mentioning that even within the Bible there's evidence that more than one source was available to the author. Right? And so, bringing us back to early in the semester when we looked at Genesis, talked about sources of the Pentateuch, the different creation stories. In the flood story, as we find it in Genesis, chapter 6 through 9, there are indications that two flood stories may have been woven together to make a single flood story. And we see this when we compare things like names for God, things that we saw as differences in the creation accounts, but also other details, right? How long does the flood last for? How many of each kind of animal taken on the ark? How many of each kind of animals taken on the ark? If I ask you that question, quick answer, don't think about it. Two, right? There are accounts, though, there are points where it mentions taking 7 of every clean animal, right? 7 of every kosher animal. Right? Why do you think it might say that? Yes, for food, for sacrifice. First thing Noah does when he gets off the ark, offer a sacrifice. If he only has 2 of that animal, it's extinct. Right? And so you can understand why these details, these divergent details might emerge. What we're going to focus on today is not the question of the sources from ancient Israel that seem to be behind this particular account as we have it in Genesis, but going back even earlier to a wider context. And so let me ask the question, when is it important or necessary to have information from outside of a text in order to understand that text? A literary approach often says, okay, let's take a look at the story. It tends to focus in particular on narratives and novels and stories of that sort, and focuses, for the most part, on understanding the text on its own terms, excluding questions like what did the author intend, or that. Are there texts where it's crucial to have information other than what's given you in that text itself? What are some examples?
Well, if it's like a biased text, that's like coming from like if it's a Christian scholar writing about Christianity, you may want to find another Christian scholar that has a different approach or something of that nature.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, for the sake of making sure you're getting the whole story, you're considering everything that's relevant, not just listening to one person's perspective. Okay, so that might be a little bit. Yeah.
I would say for like characters, like if they just say a character's name or like an emperor or a king in the Bible, and you don't know their significance or like the power they hold, so you can look that up outside the text.
Right. So there are texts which are written about particular figures, assuming that you actually know something about those figures. Right? You might think of a movie like The Passion of the Christ. Right? If you went to see that with no prior knowledge about who Jesus is, you might see it and say, "Oh my gosh, what are they doing to this guy and why?" I mean, there's no backstory. I mean, you get some flashbacks. But it would be a very puzzling movie, right? Because it assumes prior familiarity with the character. Who else?
I was going to say something very similar to what you said. If you're a new beginner on something or a new subject and you're reading or watching something that's at a higher level, you're going to have to look to an outside source to give yourself a foundation so you can understand that higher level reading.
Yeah, something that assumes prior knowledge, right? The textbook for computer programming 400. Yeah, in fact, the textbook for computer programming 100, if any of you have ever tried to even learn just a little and dabble in it, probably assumes more than it should sometimes, right? And that's not just for textbooks, right? If you jump into Harry Potter book, whichever, other than the first one, there might be an occasional reference. It's like, hang on, has she explained what a Horcrux is? Or something like that, that'll possibly.
I mean, it's not literary, but in one of my other classes, I'm in a conducting class for music, and before we're allowed to even step on the podium, we're required to turn in research about the piece that we're looking at and about the composer of the piece and what was going on in the time and place that they were writing it.
And that also leads to another great example, I think, or I hope it'll be a great example. It's certainly a relevant example, I think you'll agree. How many of you looked at least one commentary on some part of the Bible this semester? I was afraid that I wasn't going to see too many hands. Would still love to see more, right? And there's still time. If you have something that's discussing a piece of music, right, or discussing a historical figure, or focusing on one particular question about a historical figure, or discussing a piece of literature, oftentimes it will assume that you know that piece of literature or that piece of music. Right? In some commentaries on the Bible, there's actually the text running through it. In others, there is not. Right? And it assumes you actually know the story it's commenting. You probably wouldn't get a good sense of what the story is in Genesis, let's say, if you simply read a commentary on Genesis that didn't give you the text of Genesis itself within it, right? But just gave you the commentary. You'd certainly get a different impression. One last example. Any of you like watching, I don't know, Jay Leno or any comedians? That was a fairly lukewarm response.
Don't have time.
You don't have time. Okay, when you have time, over your break, right? During election season, particular times of year maybe. How much do you think you'd understand if you had been, in cryogenic suspension for, several decades or something like that, and then they let you out, and as you're recovering, Jay Leno is on. Of course, if you've been in cryogenic suspension for several decades, your first question would be, who is this guy? Right? But after you get over that hurdle, right, you'd be like, why are people laughing? What's the joke? Right? When you have allusions to political, in satire and things like that, there's often allusion to events. And unless you know what those events are, then the jokes will not be funny and you might not even get the jokes. And so, in the case of the flood story, right, we have a story which has a long history of interpretation after it. And I included a picture of baby's ark. Oh, cute cuddly little thing up there, right? Because Noah's Ark, right, with the animals and the boat, and it's great. There are versions you can play with in the bathtub and all kinds of things. I won't ask how many of you had those. I definitely won't ask how many of you still have those. But it's a story that is often told for children in various versions. Right? There's a post-history of interpretation and of use and of retelling, but there's also a prehistory. And there's fairly clear evidence that the author of Genesis was not the first person to tell this story, and that whatever Israelite sources he used were not the first to tell this story, because we have versions of the story going back long before any of those sources of the Bible even are likely to have been written. And so when we have a retelling of a well-known story, there may be things we'll need to think about. And so let me ask the question fairly directly. Right? It's a story often told to children, but what might children take away from it if they were given access not just to the playset, but to the whole story with all its details? Right? How would you evaluate the actions by the character of God in this story if they're the actions of a human being? Let's say a human being were given authority to rule over the earth, right? Over the forces of nature. Or let's say you're to substitute somebody else's God, right? Let's say Zeus was the main character rather than Yahweh. How would you respond to, how would you react to, what would you make of the actions of God in the story? What kinds of things does God do in the story? And I heard some sound effects there too. Boom, yeah.
Yeah, he would be kind of evil because he killed everybody, except for two animals that he saved, and Noah and his family. So, if we're looking at like acting as a human, I would just say he would be evil.
Wow.
I feel like it could also be seen as like a snap reaction, like instead of like dealing with it, and like working through a problem, like for like if you were using it as a story to teach a child about how to react to a situation, it could be seen as like an explosive reaction instead of confronting the problem.
We've had some interesting statements here. Is this story potentially disturbing and troubling? Theologically? Does God end up behaving in ways in the story that, if a human being behaved that way, we would say probably would say that a phrase like lost their temper was not strong enough, right? They drowned everyone. That's kind of going beyond what we usually mean by losing your temper. Right? people have long wrestled with this story, right? And so the key question I want us to spend some time thinking about today is, does placing this story in a wider history of storytelling give us any ways to make sense of why an author in ancient Israel would tell the story in the way that it did? I mean, did this ancient author not see the problems with telling a story that has these details? Was it just considered that God or gods are capricious and unpredictable and can do whatever they want? What are the assumptions? What's the background? How do we make sense of this? And does the fact that there's a longer history of storytelling about a great flood help at all? And this is where we're going to turn to the Mesopotamian versions, right? Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic. Accounts which are older than Genesis, which seem to be older than even sources that may have been used by the author of Genesis. Mesopotamian in origin, so in other words, roughly where Babylonia was. And I won't go into detail, I won't retell the story, right? You can find versions of this online. One great thing when you're studying texts that are thousands of years old is that there's usually a version that's not under copyright, right? And that's in the public domain. And so you can find accounts of a lot of these, summaries of them, excerpts from them online in a wide variety of places. If we look at the earlier versions of the story, right, what are some of the key characteristics? Well, among them is the fact that polytheism is the framework for the story. There are multiple deities. Right? And in at least some versions, the deity who was responsible for creating humankind is not interested in, not pursuing this course of action that other gods are pursuing of wiping out humankind. One of the reasons for the flood, which David mentioned in his presentation in one of the versions, is that human beings have become so populous that they've just gotten so noisy that it's basically giving the gods a headache, right? It's disturbing them. Okay? And now that might seem overkill, literally, right, in this case. Right? But if there's anyone here who lives in Ross Hall, I'm guessing that some of you can relate to the idea that you'd be willing to wipe out every single living human being just to get a good night's sleep. The people who are chuckling clearly have spent some time in the appropriate dorms. Some of you clearly live off campus and so don't have to deal with that sort of thing. The author of Genesis, or the author of the story of Genesis, or the author of the sources used by the author of Genesis, in telling an Israelite version of the story, why retell it? Well, first of all, this is one of the widespread culturally dominant stories in the part of the world. And so when you have something that's a classic, you can't simply ignore it. But what do you do with that story if it's part of your tradition, and yet you're moving, or you're part of a movement to recast that tradition in the direction of what we call monotheism? And whether that's the best terminology, whether it's monolatry, right, worship of one God alone, but acknowledging the existence of other gods, we've had those discussions, we've mentioned those issues, don't need to recap them today. But if you're trying to recast this traditional story featuring multiple gods, and have only one deity, you're going to face some challenges in recasting the story. Because the competing motives of the various gods in the earlier versions are not going to work as an explanation for how the story unfolds. Right? Having a different deity warn Utnapishtim about the approaching flood than the deities who are behind the plan for the flood doesn't work. And so how are you going to move this traditional story into a monotheistic framework? And so what the author does, or the sources that the author uses does, is to recast it in terms of divine justice and punishment. And so it makes it a story about humankind becoming unrighteous, so unrighteous that God can't tolerate it anymore, and taking action. And so the result, in many respects, has disturbing elements to it, but we can understand how you end up with some of those disturbing elements and understand what the author is trying to accomplish, and maybe put those disturbing elements in the right perspective or at least a different perspective, if we understand what the author was doing and what the author had to work with, and what the author was trying to accomplish by retelling an earlier story and reframing it in terms of monotheism. Within the story in Genesis, I do have to mention some of the things that come across in this particular example. Right? There's an emphasis on God's concern with sin and righteousness and things like that. There's also divine anger and other things which many people find troubling elements. One of the key symbolisms within the text is of new creation. And of course, if you're familiar with that imagery from elsewhere, let's say the New Testament, what you'd probably think of as new creation might not involve a global flood, wiping out everyone. But the truth is that when you have the imagery of new creation in the New Testament, it often too is preceded by destruction, judgment, things of that sort, and then a new beginning. In Genesis 1, you have this formless, void, chaotic earth that's covered by a great sea or deep, primordial sea. And what the flood story does is revert the world to that state. And so there's an undoing of creation, right, returning it to that original state, and then a starting again. And when Noah and his family leave the ark, right, you have reference to blessing, right, be fruitful and multiply, things which echo the Genesis creation story. And so one of the themes is of new creation. Before I open up the class to just general discussion, let me mention another instance, which I think I may have mentioned before, at least in passing, but at least one other example of a story that assumes knowledge from outside the text. The story of the Tower of Babel. How many of you have heard of the story of the Tower of Babel? Is that familiar to at least some of you? And of course, it neighbors the story, right, in Genesis of the flood. Right, you find it in Genesis 11, right, and it's offered at least in part as etiology. Why do human beings speak so many different languages? Where's Babel? That's Babylon, right? And in Babylon, there's a famous edifice, right? A famous construction project. The people of ancient Mesopotamia often built temples in the form of a ziggurat, which is like a stepped pyramid. Right? So you have sort of layer upon layer. Right? So it's not straight going up into a pyramid, it's like steps going up. And at one point in their history, the Babylonians decided to build the biggest ziggurat, the biggest tower anyone had ever built. And like a lot of attempts down the ages to build the biggest anything that anyone's ever built, it never got finished. And so the author of Genesis seems to be aware of that feature in Babylonia. Right? That's the existence of this piece of construction, this building, or this unfinished building. And in essence, the author is poking fun at the Babylonians. Right? Why are they called Babel, which most understand mean gate of God or door of God, and doorway to heaven, something like that. You can think of this as stairway to heaven, with or without the lens music playing as you think about it. Babylon was the major player, the major culture in the time, the major empire. And so the author pokes fun at their attempt to build this sort of stairway to heaven, as it were. And one of the ways the author pokes fun is by having God act, again, in ways that, if taken literally, might seem disturbingly inept or inadequate or limited. But when we understand this story as a political satire, we might see it as simply poking fun at the Babylonians. Right? They're trying to build a tower that will reach up to heaven. And so, what happens? If we take a look in Genesis 11, they're trying to build a tower. And then it says in verse 5, And in verse 7, Yahweh came down, come, let us go down. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the mortals had built. So this is supposed to be a tower reaching up to heaven, and God has to come down in order to even get a look at it, right? Taken literally, it's like, so you mean God couldn't see it properly? Hang on, what is? Taken as political satire, taken as the author poking fun at the Babylonians in their attempt to reach the heavens, we might take it in a different way. And so there are other examples we could give, but in the flood story, in the story of the Tower of Babel, knowledge of other things, earlier existing things, whether texts or pieces of architecture from outside of the text, things that would have been familiar to the first tellers of the story, often are important in helping us to understand the story, why the story was told in the way that it was. Because if you're recasting an earlier story, you're changing it in order to tell it differently, to do something differently with it, to put in the framework of a different viewpoint, like one that emphasizes the existence of one God alone, or the supremacy of one God alone. Changes are going to be necessary. And if we find some elements of these stories disturbing at times, understanding how they got that way can sometimes be useful.